In this passage, Machiavelli announces his break, indeed his repudiation, of all those who have come before. All those who have come before. He both replaces and yet reconfigures, according to his own lights, elements from both the Christian Empire and the Roman Republic to create a new form of political organization, distinctly his own, what we might call today the modern state. Machiavelli is the founder, the discoverer, the inventor of the modern state. This modern, secular, sovereign state was refined and developed in the decades and centuries after Machiavelli, in the writing of Hobbes, of Locke, of Rousseau, to say nothing of contemporary 20th century writers from both the right and the left, Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, to a man, an Italian philosopher named Antonio Gramsci, who was the author of a book, interestingly, called The Modern Prince, based on Machiavelli himself. Machiavelli's state itself has universalist ambitions in many ways, much like its Christian and Roman predecessors. But this is a state, he believes, that has now been liberated, or at least emancipated from Christian and classical conceptions of virtue. The management of affairs is left to those people who he calls princes, which, as the Machiavellian usage designates, a new kind of political founder or leader endowed with a new species of ambition, love of glory, and elements of prophetic authority that we might call charisma. But just what was the nature of the revolution contemplated by our founder, Machiavelli, the founder of modern political science? Consider just for a moment the title and dedication of the book. The Prince appears on its surface to be a most conventional work. It presents itself in the long tradition of what has come to be called the Mirror of Princes, books that give a kind of guide to the do's and don'ts of princely behavior. Fair enough. Seems to go back a long, long time. And the appearance of conventionality is supported by the opening words of the book. In his dedicatory letter, the first words or first line out of his mouth, or the first lines are, "It is customary," he says. It is a work intended to ingratiate himself to Lorenzo de' Medici, the man to whom the work is dedicated. A customary prince, a traditional prince, who has just regained his power. But look again. Consider the structure of the first 3 chapters. All states, all dominions that have held and do hold empire over men are either republics or principalities, he says in the opening sentence of chapter 1. Having distinguished two and only two kinds of regimes, republics and principalities, as the only ones worth mentioning, he goes on to distinguish 2 kinds of principalities. There are hereditary principalities, like those currently run by Lorenzo, which acquire their authority through tradition and bloodlines, hereditary bloodlines. And then he says there are new princes and new principalities. Machiavelli then asserts that his book will deal only with principalities, leaving, he says, the discussion of republics for elsewhere. One assumes his discourses on Livy, which he was already writing by this time. But then Machiavelli goes on to tell the reader that the exclusive subject of this book, the exclusive subject, will be the new prince. In other words, not Lorenzo at all, but precisely princes who have or will achieve their authority through their own guile, their own force, or their own virtu, to use the famous Machiavellian term that I want to talk about later. The true, in other words, recipient of this book must be necessarily the potential prince, that is to say, someone with sufficient political audacity to create their own authority, who has not simply received it from the past, but to create their own authority. Maybe one could even say Machiavelli's prince is in a way the first truly self-made man. So what then is the character of this new prince, and how does he differ from more conventional modes of princely or political authority? And in one of the most famous chapters of the book, chapter 6, entitled Of New Principalities That Are Acquired Through One's Own Arms and Virtue, there's that word again, virtu, one's own arms and virtue, Machiavelli discusses the character of the modern prince, the new prince. A prudent man, he writes, should always enter upon the paths beaten by great men and imitate those who have been most excellent, so that if his own virtue does not reach that far, it at least is in the odor of it. We at least come within, you might say, sniffing distance of their greatness. One should do, he says, what archers do when attempting to reach a distant target, namely, aim your bow high, knowing that the force of gravity will bring the arrow down. In other words, set your sights high, knowing you will probably fall short. So who are the greatest examples, he says, of princely rule that the prudent man, interesting choice of words, the prudent man should imitate? And here Machiavelli gives a list of those heroic founders of peoples and states: Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and so on. As one examines their actions and lives, he writes, one does not see that they had anything else from fortune than the opportunity which gave them the matter, enabling them to introduce any form they pleased. Notice in that sentence he uses those Aristotelian terms, form and matter, that we spoke about in relation to the Aristotelian regime. They had nothing else from fortune, he says again, than the opportunity, the occasion, that gave them the matter enabling them to introduce any form they pleased. In short, Machiavelli claims these were founders who created, in a way, ex nihilo, out of nothing. They only had the occasion and a kind of formless matter upon which they could adopt and impose any form they took. And they had, of course, the strength of mind as well as the audacity and cunning to take advantage of this situation. Such opportunities, he writes, such occasions made these men successful, and their excellent virtue enabled the opportunity to be recognized. Hence their fatherlands were ennobled by it, and they became prosperous. They took advantage of their opportunity, seized their opportunity, and imposed their own form upon it. And it is here that Machiavelli introduces his famous distinction between armed and unarmed prophets. All the armed prophets, he says, conquered, and the unarmed were ruined. This seems to be, and is clearly, a kind of classic statement of sheer Machiavellian power politics. All politics grows out of the barrel of a gun, as a famous 20th century Machiavellian once put it. The armed prophets conquer, the unarmed lose. But there seems to be more to it than this. Machiavelli compares the prince to a prophet. Why does he use that language? What is a prophet? The most obvious answer is a person to whom God speaks. Machiavelli's armed prophets may not be religious figures, and they are not necessarily recipients of divine knowledge, but they seem to be, at least on his account, people of exceptional personal qualities that allow them to bring laws, to be law-bringers, law-givers, shapers of institutions, and also reformers of opinions that govern our lives. Machiavelli's armed prophet is more than just a gangster, like Orson Welles in that part. He is a teacher and a kind of educator as well. You might even think in your class, in your sections, how or in what ways does Machiavelli's armed prophet differ in important ways, both from Plato's philosopher king as well as Aristotle's notion of the megalopsychos as the sort of magnanimous statesman. Although this kind of talk about armed prophets always win is characteristic of Machiavelli, he likes this kind of tough talk. He clearly recognizes that there are clear exceptions to his rule about armed prophets. Who comes to mind most vividly? Who, in other words, is not present in Machiavelli's list of great prophets that one should imitate? Yes. Most obvious, perhaps, certainly to his contemporaries, Jesus, who triumphed through words and teaching alone. He had no troops, he had no arms. He established a religion, first a sect, you might say, then a religion, then eventually an empire, the Holy Roman Empire that was established in the name of that teaching. Words may well be a powerful weapon, as powerful as a gun. And then you might say, what is Machiavelli himself? What is the teaching of, who is Machiavelli but an archetypal, unarmed prophet? He has no troops, he has no territory, he controls no real estate. He's been banished, yet he is clearly attempting to conquer, comparing himself to Columbus, to conquer in large part through the transformation of our understanding of good and evil, of virtue and vice. In order, in other words, to make people obey you, you must first make them believe you. No prophetic, Machiavelli's prophetic prince, in other words, must have some of the qualities of a philosopher as well as a religious reformer, trying to reshape and remold human opinion, especially opinion over, as we say, good and evil, just and unjust. What does this reformation, so to speak, or transformation consist of? We might even call this Machiavelli in the garden of good and evil, midnight in the garden of good and evil for Machiavelli. One point often attributed about Machiavelli is that he introduced a new kind of immoralism into politics. In that famous chapter, chapter 15, he says he sets out to teach the prince how not to be good. Striking formulation. He will teach the prince how not to be good. And in perhaps the most important book on Machiavelli ever written, the author of that book declared Machiavelli to be a teacher of evil. You might want to think about that, a teacher of evil. Is that what Machiavelli was? Questions of good and bad, virtue and vice, appear on virtually every page of The Prince. He is not simply a teacher of political pragmatism, of how to adjust means to fit the ends. He seems to be offering nothing short of a comprehensive revolution, transformation, if you want to use the Nietzschean language, transvaluation of our most basic vocabulary about good and evil. Machiavelli